Welcome to the Carmelite campus. My name is Mother Madonna of the Assumption, and I am from Carmel of Mary in Wapaton, North Dakota. I have the privilege and honor to be asked to give this talk. I hope and pray that you will not be bored, that you will also catch on to my dry sense of humor. There will be times where you might find this delightful. You might also find it a little bit sorrowful, but I think you can handle it. What we'll do first is the sisters and I did a video of our monastery in 2017, and so we'll watch that first, and then afterwards I'll share my vocation story with you and a little bit about the monastery, and then there will be question and answers afterwards. I hope that you will have some questions for me about my own vocation or about the vocation to the Carmelite Monastery, Carmel of Mary. All right, thank you.
When all is silent, do you hear the gentle voice? A voice from within, beckoning you to become closer to our Lord Jesus Christ. Listen, do you hear the call? The roots of the Order of Carmel are deep, stretching back 8 centuries and across thousands of miles to the Holy Land. It was there on Mount Carmel in the late 12th century that former crusaders settled in search of the living God. These men, in imitation of the prophet Elijah, chose to dwell on the mount hallowed by his memory and deeds and lead solitary lives in devotion to God. They developed a special relationship with the mother of Jesus, looking upon Mary as mother, sister, and lady of the place. They dedicated their chapel to her patronage, and so they came to be known as the Brothers of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Over time, the hermits began migrating back to their homelands in Europe, making wherever they settled their Carmel. In the 15th century, women became part of the Carmelite order, continuing the life of prayer in the spirit of the hermits. Carmel, which means garden, flowers on the prairie as the beautiful and secluded home to North Dakota's Carmelite nuns. The way of the original hermits, living in silence and solitude, is still maintained in the perpetual enclosure of its North Dakota modern counterpart, the Carmel of Mary Monastery. For most of their day and night, the sisters cultivate an atmosphere of silence throughout the monastery, for it is through prayer that the Carmelite nun seeks God. The rule of Carmel bids the Carmelite to stay in her room or nearby, pondering on the word of the Lord day and night, keeping watch at her prayers. When duty calls her forth from the solitude of her room, she carries with her that awareness of God's presence. Do you hear that voice in the gentle breeze? The same quiet voice that called to Elijah on the mountain so long ago. The very summons Elijah's successors have faithfully heeded year after year. Do you feel a stirring in your heart, calling you to embark on a deeper devotion to God as a Carmelite nun? At the Carmel of Mary Monastery, the day begins at midnight. The nuns rise from their sleep to offer their praise to God, offering reparation for the nighttime sins of the world. The sisters then retire for a few more hours of rest. They rise again at dawn to begin the morning by coming together in prayerful chanting. Once this is completed, each sister spends an hour of personal prayer. This is followed by the sisters coming together to celebrate in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The Carmelite nun seeks the face of God in the Eucharistic liturgical prayer and through her personal prayer. From these sources, she draws strength for the day's demands on body and soul in her work, study, and recreation. Each day brings its own duties and surprises, but the regular rhythm of liturgical prayer punctuates the day's activity. The Vespers bell calls the nuns to assemble for evening prayer, where they gather up the day and offer it to the Lord. Another hour of personal prayer follows Vespers. A period of recreation rounds out the day. The observance of silence is relaxed, and the nuns come together and share their day. During this time, they might share their joy through music, working on their individual artwork or crafts, perhaps some sewing or weaving, or a little gardening. They might spend the time doing some baking, possibly joining together for a fun celebration, or simply enjoying some lively conversation. After night prayer, when the time to retire comes, the Carmelite is ready to rest. The quest for God is a lifelong adventure, and for the Carmelite nun, there are specific stages along the journey. When a woman hears the Lord beckoning her to Carmel, she asks to enter the monastery. For 6 to 12 months, she lives in the cloister, the section of the monastery set aside only for nuns, following along with the sister's daily routine and affirming the call. After this period of initial discernment, the candidate is received into the novitiate, the time of formation, and receives the habit of Carmel. This stage of the journey as a novice lasts from 1 to 2 years, testing further the vocation to the contemplative life. When the time of the novitiate is completed, she will make her profession of vows for a period of 3 to 6 years, continuing the study she began in the novitiate and intensifying her relationship with God in her daily prayer. All of these periods of formation are to prepare the nun for the day of her solemn profession, when she vows her life to God forever. And the journey continues, walking securely under the maternal protection of Blessed Mother Mary. The Carmelite mirrors within her heart the love of Jesus for his mother. Each day, the Carmelite is being formed by the Holy Spirit, drawing closer to her desired goal until the final destination is reached and the lifelong search for God is rewarded in an endless encounter, face to face. Is this the journey for you? Do you hear the gentle voice from within, calling you to join the Order of Carmel and follow their path to become closer to our Lord Jesus Christ? Listen, do you hear the call?
Now I'd like to share with you my vocation story and then go on about the life at Carmel of Mary. My parents are originally from Texas, and so they had 4 children. My sisters, my 2 older sisters were born in Texas, and then my parents moved to Santa Barbara, California, and I was born there. Then they decided to move back to Texas, and they had my younger brother. It was in Texas that I was in the 1st grade, and it was then that I had an experience when we went to catechism class because we went to a public school. And so when the teacher passed out the books, the catechism book, on the front cover was a picture of Jesus. When she handed me the book, it was at that moment that I felt in my heart love at first sight. It was at that moment that I knew that I was in love with Jesus Christ and that I wanted to give him all of my heart. Now, in the 1st grade, I wasn't quite sure what all that meant and how I could do that. And so by the 2nd grade, I was starting to ask people, how I could express that to God. And some of them were saying, well, you need a calling if you want to become a nun or if you want to become a sister. So it was around the end of my second grade year into my third grade year that I went to confession. And I asked the priest in the confessional, how do I know that God is calling me to become a nun or a sister? And he said, well, let me ask you some questions. And so he asked me some questions. And at the end, he said, I believe God is calling you to marry Jesus. I was so excited. I can't tell you. I can still feel it to this day. And I had rode my bike to confession. So I jumped on my bike and I rode home as fast as I could to tell the good news to my family. And so as soon as I got home, I called everybody to the dining room, and my siblings came, my parents came, and I said, I have great news. And they're like, what is it? And I said, Father said that God is calling me to marry Jesus. And there was like dead silence. and my siblings, they just turned around and walked out of the room. And then there I was with my parents, and my parents said, we need to talk. I said, we do? And yes. And so the three of us sat down, and it was at that time that my parents told me, you know, we really want you to get married, and we really want you to have a large family. And not only that, but we really want you to live next door. And then we want you to take care of us when we get elderly. I'm like, so at this age, I'm like, I'm not sure that sounds like really what I want. So I said, okay. And then they said, and the last thing, we don't want you ever to talk about becoming a nun. And I'm like, really? You know, so I was like, oh my goodness. So time went on, and I was about 15 or 16. And my parents tell me, you know, this is the time where you're going to start dating, and, you know, you need to start wearing cosmetics and looking nice. And I'm like, really? And so then I started dating, and I thought, well, you know, maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe I could find somebody to marry, you know. So in those years, I was starting to date, and after the first day, I said, you know, what would really be nice? And they're like, what? And I said, like, if we could go to Mass before we went out on a date, like, you know, they have Mass in the evening. I said, and then afterwards, I said, you know, I have to be home by midnight. You could take me home, and then you could pick me up in the morning, and we'd go to Mass again, and then we could, you know, and so there really, so you can imagine what the second date was like. There was no second date, So then time went on, and I'm a senior now, and my father's like, you know, what are you going to do with your life? He said, you know, are you going to go to college? Are you going to do this or that? And I said, Dad, you know, I still want to become a nun. And he's like, pick something else out. And I'm like, really? So then I went to some nursing schools, but nothing spoke to me. And I said, Lord, what do you want me to do? You know, Mom and Dad don't want me to become a nun, and the nursing schools, you know, don't seem like that's where I'm being called. And so one day after I got out of high school, I was driving home, and I felt the inspiration to drive into this parking lot. So I drove into the parking lot, I parked the car, and then before my eyes, there was the four branches of the military. And I'm like, oh my goodness, who, me? I've never given the military a thought. And so then I felt this inner inspiration say yes. And I'm like, okay, now how do I pick out which branch? I mean, like, I'm just not military material. So I'm like, well, maybe the Navy, that, you know, that probably wouldn't be so bad. So I went in, and the Navy recruiter's just looking at me. He said, what can I do for you? And I'm like, I'm not sure. And he said, well, the first thing you're going to need to do is cut your hair. And I said, well, I'm not ready for that. So I turned around, I left, and then I said, well, I got 3 more. So I said, well, maybe the Air Force. I said, they were blue, maybe that wouldn't be so bad. So I walked into the Air Force office there with the recruiter, and he says, what can I do for you? And I looked at him, I said, well, I need to cut my hair. He said, no, but you have to pin it up. I said, you know what, I can handle that. And so he said, well, let me tell you about the Air Force. So he told me about the Air Force. And I said, yeah. And he said, why don't you go home and think about it? And I said, okay. So I went home and I thought about it. And then I returned back a couple of days. And he says, well, why don't you take the test and see how you do? And I said, okay. So I took the test. And I went back. And he said, you did pretty good. He said, you can either go into the finance department or into the medical field. And I said, oh, well, probably the medical field. He said, oh, no. He says, let me tell you. He says, the hours won't be good that you get. He says, why don't you go into the finance? And I said, okay. So then afterwards, he said, well, why don't you think about it some more and then come sign the papers? And I says, okay. So I waited a couple of days. I went back to sign the papers and I was getting ready to sign. He says, wait. He said, have you told your parents? I said, you don't know my parents. And he's like, he said, well, he said, I don't know your parents. He says, but I still think you need to tell them before you sign. And I'm like, oh dear. So I went and I got a dozen of red roses. I said, this will help the situation. So I walk in the house with the red roses and my mom said, what are you up to? I says, Mom, I need to talk to you and Dad. And she's like, okay. So she brings my dad in and we're there at the dining room table. And I said, I'm going into the Air Force. And my father turned 10 shades of red. My mother was 5 shades of red. And my parents said, no daughter of ours is going into the military. I said, I'm going. And they're like, no, you cannot go. And my father said, I will disown you as my daughter. I says, Dad. And he's like, you don't know what they're going to do to you. They're going to, do this and that. And I'm like, Dad, many women have gone in. So for the next 6 months, I need to get in shape and I need to get myself mentally prepared for the Air Force. And so I spent those 6 months getting ready. My parents are very upset at this time, and I do go into the Air Force. And I do make it through boot camp by the grace of God only, because everybody knows in San Antonio it rarely snows. Well, I went in January, and sure enough, I was there a week, and it snows. I mean, it snows so bad that we couldn't do a lot of the outdoor activities that we normally do, all the marching, all the running, all that was reduced. So I knew God was looking after me. And so then after boot camp, I went through my training, and then they are going to station me in England. And so I call home and I tell my mom, they're going to station me in England. And she said, did you say New England? I said, no, Mom. I said England, like the country. She said, oh my goodness, you're going to be so far away. I said, yeah. So I go to England, and I'm there probably about 6 months. And the chaplain there announces they're going on a pilgrimage. And I'm like, oh, well, I'll go. So I don't even know where they're going. And then I'm on the bus, and the ladies are like, do you know where we're going? I'm like, wait, no. And then somebody asked the chaplain, well, where exactly are we going? And he said, we're going to Aylesford. He said, like St. Simon's Stock. And I'm like, oh my goodness, because I had devotion to St. Simon's Stock, and that's Carmelite Center there. And so when I got there, it was just like, it was totally planned by God. And so I'm in England for 3 years. And during those 3 years, the last 3 years, a friend of mine said, are you being called to the religious life? And I said, I couldn't deny it at that point. I said, yes, I am. And she says, well, you might start preparing. I said, how can I do that? And she says, by a prayer life. And she said, also, she says, nuns don't wear cosmetics. And I said, oh. So I put all my cosmetics in a box and I sent them home to my mom. And then I went to work that next day. And there in the Air Force, I worked with all men in the office. And so I noticed that they were kind of looking at me, but they weren't saying anything. And then one of them came up to me and said, are you feeling all right today? And I said, why? And he's like, you just somehow look different. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not wearing any cosmetics. And he's like, oh, you're not? And I says, yeah. And I says, I'm going to be a nun. And he said, you? And I'm like, yeah. I said, and I'm starting to prepare. And he's like, wow, And so believe it or not, after that got around, I had more dates than I ever had before. I told one of my friends, I said, I don't get it. why would I have more dates now? And she says, because she said young men at that age are not looking for a wife. They just want to go out and have, fun with somebody, with a woman. I said, oh, I said, yeah. I says, you know what? That didn't dawn on me. So I thought that was very insightful to hear that. So then now I'm going to be stationed in the United States, and it will be my last year, and that will be in Tennessee. So I spent my last year in Tennessee, and it is in Tennessee that I start looking up religious communities. And in those days, we didn't have the internet because this would be in 1988. And so I had a thick catalog, and I went right directly to the Carmelites. And then when I found Carmel of Mary in the catalog, the picture of the sister in prayer struck me. So then I went to the monastery for a visit, and I knew that that was where I was being called. And so then I started preparing, and I went home for a visit, and I told my parents that because my father had asked me, this is your third year in the Air Force, he said, you're doing so well. He said, are you going to make a career of it? I looked at Dad. I said, oh, Dad, out of all people. And he's like, yeah, and I'm like, no, Dad. I said, I'm going to do what I've always wanted to do. And he's like, what's that? I said, I'm going to become a nun, a cloistered nun. He's like, oh my goodness. He's like, where? I said, North Dakota. And he's like, oh my goodness. He says, that's going to be so far. He said, we're going to need to go see you all the way over there. And I said, yes, you will, Dad. And so then I forgot this little detail. Before I came to visit the monastery, I had to call them to ask them for information. Well, I decided that before I went to work that I would call early in the morning at 6 o'clock. And I said, if they don't answer the phone, that means that that's not the monastery. So at 6 o'clock, the phone is ringing and ringing. But on the other end at the monastery, Sister Margaret Mary, who's the prioress, was at prayer, and she's like, the phone is ringing. Who would be calling at 6 o'clock in the morning? Like, should I even answer it? And then she said that she felt inspired. Yes, answer the phone. So she went and she answered it. And when I heard her voice, I was like, oh my goodness, it sounds like an angel right from heaven. And so I asked her to send me information. So she sent me the information, and then I came for a visit. And then when I was there for the visit, we were talking about when I should enter. And I said, I have one more year left in the Air Force. Should I ask to leave early and then enter? And the sister says, no, why don't you go ahead and finish out your last year and then enter afterwards. And I thought that was very wise, because they said by the time you get the paperwork done, it will probably take about a year. So I said, okay. So then I entered 3 months after my last year in the Air Force. I spent those 3 months with my parents, and then I entered. So what I want to do now is give you some added information, because I think that this part is very important. My father died in 2001, and my mom just passed away this last May. So when I normally, before, when I would share my vocation story, this little element I would not share with others out of a respect for my mom and also for my dad. But now that mom is home with the Lord, I feel I can share it. So in my family, growing up, my father was an alcoholic. And not only an alcoholic, but an abusive alcoholic. And so us children grew up in that kind of atmosphere. And if you have ever lived with an alcoholic, you know that there's usually a pattern to their behavior. And so us children knew what we needed to do when my father was starting to drink to an excessive point. And then when he got into his rage, we all knew what to do. So my older sister, was her job to always distract, to protect my mom from my father. And then my sister, the second born, it was her job to call the police. And then my brother would try to distract my father from my mother. And so my siblings, thanks be to God, kept me well protected, because we never knew what dad would do in those moments. And so they would tell me, go over there and pray. And so it was then that I learned the importance of prayer. And the prayer at that time was that nobody would get hurt because we don't know when an alcoholic is in a rage. And so sure enough, the police would come and they would take Dad away. And there was calm and relief after that. But then there's always the next day. And what happens the next day? Dad comes back into the house. So it starts all over. You know, you think, okay, when is the next time? You know, and so during this time, us children would be praying and praying, and we would even talk to Mom, you know, can something be done? And for her, the answer was, your father needs to come back. And sure enough, he comes back. And so we did this for many, many years. And Mom always loved Dad, and she always remained faithful to him. So now that Mom has passed away, I think what I've learned from that is my mom's faithfulness to my father. As children, we sometimes don't understand those ways, and we know that now they're both up in heaven and they've met God. So what I want to say and share with you, the reason I bring that up is because of the woundedness. We are all wounded in one way or another. None of us live on this earth without some type of wound. And it's, what are we as adults going to do with that wound? Are we going to nurse it for something good, or are we going to allow it to make us bitter inside and live it out in that way? And we know from one generation to another, things come down through the generations, and we want to put a stop to some of this behavior, some of this woundedness, you know. And so the reason I entered the monastery is because of my love for God. And not only my love for God, but my love for everything and everyone He has created. And so my life of prayer is very important to me, and I think it's very important to each of you, because I take each of you in my prayers and all your intentions. And the more prayer intentions we get at the monastery, the better. A lot of people think, oh, I don't want to burden you with another prayer intention. But for me, it's just like, wow, this is like getting a dozen of red roses, because your faith in our prayers strengthens us at the monastery. And we are so grateful for that. So now I'm going to go back to my entering the monastery. So now I'm knocking on the door, asking to enter, and I'm going to enter with my woundedness. You know, how does one survive in a monastery with her own woundedness? You know, that's going to be played out in different ways. And so before I entered the monastery, I felt like a fish on dry land. But once I entered through the enclosure, I was like a fish in an ocean of love. The life is that good. The life is full of love. The women that I live with, the other nuns, they too have that same goal, and that goal is love. Yes, we have our own humanness, but we're all there for the same goal. And I do believe I'm living with some very saintly and holy women. And so our life there at the monastery, we wake up at 5, and by 5:30 in the morning, we are in the chapel. And we're going to chant the Psalms at 5:30 in the morning. Now, I have two sisters that are 85 and 86, and they are right there chanting the office. It is so edifying to see them chant in the office. So we do that from 5:30 to 6, and then from 6 to 7, we have an hour of personal prayer. And then from 7, at 7 o'clock, we have Holy Mass. At 8 o'clock, we have breakfast. And then we have a little brief time for work. And then at 9 o'clock in the morning, we have another time of prayer together until 9:30. And then we have spiritual reading, and we also have a holy hour. And then we're back to praying at 11:15, and then we have lunch at 11:45, and then we're back in the chapel at 12:50, and then at 3 o'clock we have a prayer that we say at 3 o'clock, and then we come back at 4:30, and then from 5 to 6 we have another hour of prayer, and then at 6 we have supper, and then 6:30 we do the dishes. At 7 o'clock we have recreation, and at 7:50 we have night prayer. And then after night prayer we go to our rooms and we prepare for bed, and then we're usually in bed by 9:30, and then the day starts again. So that's our day there. I think that I'm going to go ahead and end it there, and then take you for any questions that you might have about our life, maybe something that, some questions that you might be thinking about.